Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar in our Marketing Club series. We've got a great session today with Maxine Hands. We'll talk about the rise of cancel culture and its impact on brands, and how brands can use cancel culture as a force for good. If you'd like to turn your webcam on, Maxine, I'll pass things over to you, and the floor is yours when you're ready.
Brilliant. Thanks, Phil. I really appreciate the opportunity to come join your CIM Marketing Club, so thank you for that. Just to give you a little bit background on myself, I've been in the industry about 25 years, and I've worked both between the UK, internationally, and also within Ireland. I've been really fortunate through my career, and I've worked with some incredible brands ranging from the likes of Mars and the Observer newspaper in the UK, Allied Domecq and Tommy Hilfiger on an international basis, and then more recently IKEA, Permanent TSB, Kerry Foods, RTE, all whilst I've been living in Ireland. I guess, as it said in my biog, I am a bit of a self-confessed data nerd, and I really do find consumer behaviour fascinating. So kind of when I got the opportunity to write a piece for the paper that combined media and consumer behaviour, I absolutely jumped at it, and that's what I'm going to talk you guys through now. The core of the presentation that I'm going to talk through really focuses on the rise of cancel culture, how cancel culture affects brands, and then some thoughts on how brands can navigate this kind of very perilous area. Just to set the scene, before I kick into kind of the full piece, I think it's good to take a step back, and we've all seen the phenomenal rise of social media since it first launched, and I did a little bit of research on this, and apparently the first site, called 6 Degrees, launched back in 1997, which was based on the principles of 6 degrees of separation. And then we saw other sites coming through. One which I do remember was MySpace, that launched in 2003. And you've got this kind of flow through: Bebo 2005, LinkedIn was back actually in 2003, Twitter 2006, Facebook 2008, Instagram 2010, Snapchat 2011, TikTok 2017, and then more recently Clubhouse was 2020. And I think what I find really interesting is, despite the fact that social media launched so long ago, even in the last 6 years, we've actually seen a continued growth within the global user base, and it's actually more than doubled in the last 6 years. And the spend by brands using social media has followed a similar-ish pattern, and estimates suggest that spend has tripled in the last 5 years. So that increase in penetration has given everyone access to express themselves, and is really what I would say I can never even say this word, democratized opinions. Basically, with one click of a button, anyone can share their thoughts and opinions. What it does mean is not all opinions get seen globally, but it does make them accessible for everybody. We've also seen that social media has become what I would say is a dominant force in shaping public opinions. If you cast your minds back to the Cambridge Analytica scandal around the 2016 election, I know it's an extreme example, but social media can be used in kind of very manipulative ways. And we see the impact of social media just on people's opinions in general. So basically, the democratization of opinions through social media can really result in what I would call polarizing extremes, which runs the risk of stifling constructive debate. There are times where social media becomes a battleground for what I would say is extremists to shout their opinions without considering any counter arguments, or leading to, I guess what it does is it leads to division instead of healthy discussion. And we're seeing it used as turf war, essentially, where small numbers of the more extreme opinions try and outshout each other. They're not listening to other counter arguments. They're just shouting, and it kind of essentially shuts down debate, because people are afraid of voicing their opinion and afraid of getting involved, because it is just two little shouty sides on both sides. So rather than being that platform for healthy debate, which is what I think most of us would essentially want social media to be, it actually at times can become quite a divisive platform for polarizing extreme views. I actually took a step back from this, and when I looked into it, I found it really, really interesting that despite that level of penetration, and you're seeing some of the social platforms are kind of like 94% penetration, and despite that level of penetration, there's actually a huge number of people who aren't posting regularly. At Dentsu, they conduct an annual survey, which is the Consumer Connection Study. And that survey showed that while 61% of the UK population read other people's posts on social media every week, and that number goes up to 71% on a monthly basis, only 23% of people actively post on social media every week, again, increases to 40% monthly. And the UK isn't standing alone with that. There's really similar figures across multiple markets. So, for example, in the US and Spain, that figure is 34% of posting weekly. It drops to 27% in New Zealand, 18% in France, and down to 15% in Germany. So it's a kind of big figure. And that, I think, comes into play because the fear of judgment is a real concern for people. And there's a huge number of people who have stopped themselves from expressing political or social views out of fear of judgment or negative responses. There was a recent YouGov survey that showed that the fear of judgment or negative reactions had caused many Britons to hold back on expressing their political or social views, and actually stated 57% said they've censored themselves. And then on top of that, there's a Dentsu Pulse study from 2022, which showed 81% of Irish people are concerned about mass shaming on social media. And I think more and more, we're seeing it, particularly in fact this year and even last, the impact of cancel culture on free speech is being hotly debated. And I suppose the way I would describe it is there's a spectrum of opinions. So what you've got on one side is people are arguing, and I think very rightfully so, that it gives a voice to marginalised communities, it allows them to speak out against injustices, it holds individuals and companies accountable for their actions, and that all in turn has led to increased scrutiny of public figures and celebrities and companies, and they're all now held to a higher standard than ever before, which I think is a real positive. But on the other side of that spectrum, people are kind of calling out the fact that social media is used, as I kind of said before, as a bit of a pile-on, and people just being very loud, very vocal, and it's become this tool for silencing some of the dissenting voices, and potentially even, you could say, stifling debate. Whatever your view on that spectrum, it's definitely clear that there's evidence that shows that it's given rise to what we're calling cancel culture. So the practice of boycotting or shaming individuals or companies for their beliefs and actions that are deemed unacceptable or controversial on social media. And what we're actually also seeing is that social media algorithms are playing a really significant role in shaping public opinion and discourse, because it's presenting users with content that they're most likely to engage with, and it creates what I'd call echo chambers, which amplify certain voices and suppress others. So what it results in is a distorted view of reality and essentially the spread of cancel culture. So when you're looking at kind of all of those elements, the onset of a social media storm and cancel culture in itself really depends on various factors coming together. So not every situation arises that creates cancel culture. Not every situation or negativity or negative post kind of drives a big movement, shall we say. So social movements tend to take off more often because of a perfect storm of circumstances. And what we'll see is several things occurring at the same time, and they generate emotion to drive a cause forward. When I've looked at this, it tends to be, I've identified what I would say is there's three common elements. So the trigger will be, say, a newsworthy or a shocking event. And then there's that use of social media that connects people fast and it allows an idea or a sentiment to spread in an absolute flash. But off the back, or not off the back, but as an underlying element, there's normally an underlying issue or sentiment that has essentially bubbled to the surface that are leading people to finally express their views because of that newsworthy or shocking event in itself. I don't know if any of you have ever kind of looked at the studies, but Edelman produced a really interesting annual study called the Edelman Trust Barometer, and they often produce a number of different papers off the back of it, and it's kind of really great information within there. In their 2018 study, it showed that 64% of consumers would buy or boycott a brand based solely on its stance on a social or political issue. And it also noted that 60% of consumers in that same survey actually do want to see a brand's values and positions on critical issues before they make a purchase. So if we're talking about people buying or boycotting a brand because of its stance on political and social issues, I don't know if any of you remember the Pepsi ad that was back in 2017 with Kendall Jenner. And at the time, there was a lot of social noise about this, and the ad was accused of trivializing and appropriating Black Lives Matter, the movement of it, and being essentially tone deaf and insensitive. Critics also pointed out that Jenner, a white woman, was able to resolve the conflict in the ad simply by offering a can of soda, while Black protesters often face violence and arrest. So that ad was very quickly pulled by Pepsi, and they apologized for the controversy. But it seems like a fair amount of damage had actually been done really quickly. I've kind of looked through, and some analysts would estimate that the PepsiCo sales fell by as much as 5% in the quarter following the ad's release, which I think we all know that would represent a loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And in addition to the direct sales impact, the ad caused overall PepsiCo brand reputation damage. And a YouGov study found that PepsiCo's brand favorability, their score fell by 10 percentage points in the week after the ad was released. More recently than that, the Dentsu CCS survey from 2022 report showed that globally 44% of adults have stopped using a brand because of a company's social or political stance. And 45% believe that cultural movements on social media, such as Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, have a positive effect on society. A more recent example of a brand falling foul kind of within social media was Bud Light and Dylan Mulvaney's TikTok post. So Bud Light sent a personalized can to a number of influencers, and one of those was Dylan. And for her, it was to celebrate her 365th day living as a trans woman. What they hadn't anticipated and they hadn't expected was there was a huge conservative backlash. So that all kicked off, and there was a big social media firestorm on that. But in addition to that, they were hit by a huge amount of criticism from some people within the LGBTQ plus community for how they responded to the backlash and how they managed it. And from the research I've done, apparently sales dropped by 23% in May 23 versus the previous year. So it's a very perilous area to be kind of playing within. I found it really interesting. There's a neuromarketing blog on consumer psychology called Pop Neuro, and they actually explain the connection between consumer behavior and brand actions, as kind of brand actions being rooted in people's social identity. And what they say is consumers associate brands and celebrities as a form of self-expression, and conversely, they believe that that means consumers can cancel those brands to express their own values as well. And therefore, brand behavior really matters to consumers as it reflects their own self-perception and shared values. So if you take a look at some of the kind of movements that are out there, brands supporting Pride movement with the use of the rainbow symbol have gained huge amount of popularity in the last kind of few years. This slide shows you just a few of the brands that have stood alongside the Pride movement over the last few years, anything from Peloton, Disney, Gap, John Frieda, Lego, Skittles, Levi, Reebok, Adidas, Olay and Apple, just to name a few. But there is a watch out that I would give to brands, because consumers are growing increasingly skeptical of what I would call tokenism, and they're actually demanding brands' actions aligned with their declared support. So there's been more and more accusations of what I would call rainbow capitalism. And those accusations are on the rise because people are fed up with companies that pay lip service to a cause without actually making tangible efforts to advance the LGBTQ+ rights. And to be a good example of that, they fell foul of it in 2022. You can see on the screen, they released a Red Bull Pride edition in June 22 to celebrate Pride Month. But there was quite a lot of backlash from the LGBTQ+ community, who felt that the company were rainbow washing and pandering to queer people. Many people actually argued that the can was nothing more than a marketing gimmick, and Red Bull had no real commitment to the LGBTQ+ rights. Some people also pointed out that the company had a history of supporting anti-LGBTQ+ politicians and organisations. So I think what this tells us is just slapping a rainbow flag on a product isn't enough to show support. What people are expecting is companies to be truly committed to the LGBTQ+ rights and equality, and demonstrate it through their business actions and activities as well. If you take a step back and look at the Black Lives Matter movement as well, likewise, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, a number of brands, loads and loads of brands, stepped out and voiced their support for Black Lives Matter. But a lot of them were accused of hypocrisy, with consumers asking, were they genuinely involved in the anti-racism cause, or were they actually just trying to raise their own profile and tailgate on culture, essentially? Nike was one of the many brands that voiced their support, and they backed it up with public actions and campaigns, and they had big campaigns and big kind of the videos, this kind of for once don't do it. There was a lot of activity that they pushed out there. But at the same time, there was attention drawn to the fact that in 2019, less than 10% of Nike's 300+ vice presidents worldwide were Black. And there's a really interesting article, if you get a chance to kind of go in and take a look at it. It's in Marketing Week. It was written by Mark Ritson back in June 2020, where he called this out specifically, and he showed a series of boards where they were in the same situation, that they were voicing support for Black Lives Matters, but they had literally minimal or no representation of Black people on their kind of senior positions. So some of the brands that he called out were Adidas, Spotify, L'Oreal, even Apple. But he said in the article, he actually listed off, he said that he had identified, just through Google search, he had identified 46 companies that were supporting it, but not actually living it within their company structure. There's also another side to kind of the potential ramifications or implications of cancel culture. And that's where brands need to consider the long-term effects of their actions, and they actually need to be sensitive to the current social climate. If you think about it, social climate and the current zeitgeist can change and evolve and develop. And in 2022, Amazon actually faced criticism excuse me, for an ad in the US. The ad seemed to downplay the role of organised labour in shaping working conditions and pay for workers. It depicted workers at Amazon as contented and well compensated, and it ignored a lot of the reality of working conditions faced by many of the company's employees. Critics pointed out that Amazon had this long history of labour disputes, and it had been accused of treating its workers unfairly. And in recent years, there's been a growing movement of workers in both Amazon and other companies that are in the gig economy advocating for better pay and working conditions. So the ad that they released was really seen as being tone deaf because it ignored that context. And the backlash basically reflected that growing concern. So Amazon eventually pulled the ad and issued a statement acknowledging that they had a real need to do more to support its workers. Yeah, sorry, I'm got a frog in my throat there. Having said all of that, and encouraging brands to be very cautious around kind of political and social issues, problems do arise, and a brand can get called out for kind of having genuine good intentions. And I think what needs to be said is when things go wrong, actually just admitting and accepting responsibility for past wrongdoings can result in positive outcomes if it's handled properly. A really good example of this was back in 2020 when L'Oréal Paris expressed support for the Black Lives Matters in the wake of George Floyd's death. But Monroe Bergdorf, the model, called out the brand's hypocrisy because she cited that she was fired in 2017 over a Facebook post that she made, which discussed white supremacy after the Charlottesville riots. And her words and her condemnation basically sparked a boycott of L'Oréal, with followers promising never to purchase the brand again. What was really interesting was L'Oréal Paris's brand president, and I'm going to say her name so wrong, so please I apologize in advance, Delphine Viguier, so apologies for destroying that surname. She basically took immediate action. She hired Bergdorf to do a diversity and inclusion advisory board. She also donated $50,000 to a trans organization and to Black Pride. And she kind of held the company's hands up and acknowledged that the brand had past shortcomings, and she took tangible steps to show that they were working at being better. And you can see the post there from Bergdorf basically stating that she was kind of now involved and respected and appreciated kind of the move and the start taking. What's also interesting is that some brands are actually getting it right, and they are aligning their actions with their values. Ben & Jerry's is one of the companies that has done it really, really well. They publicly supported Black Lives Matter in 2020, and they posted on the need to recognise and tackle systemic institutionalised racism, and they included a statement that denounced the culture of white supremacy in America. That stance was very consistent with their position on this issue, which they'd actually been promoting since 2014. Ben & Jerry's has a really, really long history of positive contribution to social and environmental issues, and they've got 34 years of reporting on their progress in this area. And in 2021, their annual donation to non-profit foundation that they had set up was for more than 4.75 million. So finally, cancel culture can also drive change for brands as they become aware of their social impact. Things like the rebranding of products like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's show that companies can recognise that their historical identities may have had negative connotations, and they actually needed to change in response to social pressures. So to wrap up and kind of summarise everything, I think it's important to note that with the ever-increasing impact of social media, if brands want to be vocal about social issues, or in fact connect with their consumers in a more intrinsic way, it's absolutely vital that they get their houses in order and they are authentic and completely supportive behind the causes that they pick. So thank you. I'll hand back to Phil.
Thank you, Maxine. That was absolutely fascinating. So we're now going to head into our Q&A session. We've already received a number of questions to get us underway, so thank you very much for those. But please do continue to post your questions, and we'll try and get through as many as we can in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. And just a reminder that if you want to find out more about the Marketing Club, you can use the QR code we popped up on screen. And if you want to comment about the session on the socials, you can use the hashtag CIM events. Okay, here's the first question for you, Maxine. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter author, and Graham Linehan father Ted writer have both been cancelled for their views on transgender rights. Is this quite scary for people that admire their work or even work with their work?
Absolutely. I think that's kind of one of the examples that I would give, that if you go back to some of the stats over the fact that people are now cautious, and they've edited themselves in terms of post on social media because they are afraid of what the kind of the pile-on could be if they express a view or express support. So yeah, I think it's a shame that social media has created that kind of environment, because to me, the ability to have informed debate and informed discussions with people who do have different opinions to yourself is vital, because it broadens people's opinions, it broadens people's perspective on things. But if they're being shut down, people aren't going to be expressing it, and that's what I think has exacerbated cancel culture, the fact that people are afraid to express it. So you end up just with the most shouty people who have the most vehement views, screaming at each other, and kind of everybody else is sitting quietly on the sidelines, afraid to get involved.
Thank you. Okay, so who within an organisation should be responsible for responding to any challenges around cancel culture?
I think it can sit within the kind of the marketing and the PR department. I think it's important that brands have very clear brand identity, brand guidelines. If there are situations where they've maybe acted outside of those guidelines and they are being criticised or critiqued for something they've done, then I think it's a case of being able to either, in certain instances, if it's relatively minor and it's not going to kind of kick off, it's almost worth keeping the brand's head down and just letting things progress. But I think there's a lot of credibility in actually holding hands up and acknowledging where there's been maybe an error of judgment or a kind of an issue and responding to it. So yeah, I think within the marketing and the PR department, there should be a framework for how to respond and how to kind of manage those situations so that it's dealt with quickly and efficiently.
Thank you. And on a similar theme, McDonald's are currently in the news for all the wrong reasons regarding the way they treat some of their staff. Of course, McDonald's is based largely around a franchise sort of model. So how do you manage that situation whereby you might have a rogue franchisees misrepresented the brand in that sort of way?
I think there's still, although the franchisees may be kind of misrepresenting the brand overall, essentially McDonald's is still ultimately kind of responsible and would need to be issuing guidelines and kind of working with the kind of the franchisees to ensure that their behaviours and their actions are living up to the brand values of McDonald's. So you've got that kind of way up of should have very clear brand values. If the franchisees are breaking those values and if they're not living up to them, then McDonald's should be getting involved with those franchisees and kind of correcting it to make sure that they are living up to it. If McDonald's are more lax and kind of sitting back and not kind of creating those values and not enforcing it or encouraging it within their franchise group, then McDonald's need to go away and create those to make sure that there isn't damage done by the franchisees.
Okay, thank you. Question from a student. I'm doing my dissertation on cancel culture's impact on buyer behaviour, more specifically the authenticity of consumer responses regarding these incidents, and to what extent the consumer response are just performative activism to fit in social groups. The goal is to assess how much of the threat cancel culture is on consumer responses. Do you have any advice for this project?
It's a very big question, and kind of like you said, if it's part of a dissertation, I think that there's a lot of research and there's a lot of reporting out there in terms of what the ultimate kind of impact of certain positions and certain stances have taken. Some of the examples that I kind of gave on, for example, PepsiCo's impact on their kind of overall sales. Now, you don't always get that level of detail, but a lot of the annual reports and a lot of the financial reports that are issued can give you some level of indication. But you're right that the perceived or the stated consumer behavior versus, say, genuine actions, I think is a really interesting position to take, and I think it would be worth building out, trying to kind of create a list of as many possible social or cancel culture issues that have come up for different brands, and then working through the kind of the reports. And there's a huge amount of information online in terms of the data of what has happened. It's also worth looking at something like the Edelman Trust report, because that often gives stats in terms of a brand's position year on year in terms of whether it's one of the trusted brands or not. So being able to align that and connect it with some of the pushback that has happened through cancel culture might be interesting for you to take. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Probably looking at some of the YouGov reports and talking to YouGov about some of their trackers to try to see how a brand has kind of stood up and kind of how strong it is. So you don't just look at the ultimate sales and the revenue, but also look at kind of brand perceptions and kind of brand equity to try and see year on year, have they been affected, if they have been, or if they've fallen foul of cancel culture. Does that help at all?
Really, really useful. Thank you for that. Is the Edelman Trust Barometer, is that freely available?
Yes. Yeah, just got to Google it.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned at the start that algorithms, social media algorithms are actually assisting the spread of cancel culture. I'm just wondering regarding regulation. Is there a role for regulation here? And also, very recently, the UK has appointed a Minister for Common Sense. I mean, I guess that Minister's brief will be some work within this area as well. Have you got any thoughts around all of that?
Yes, it's a really difficult one. So I feel that there should be more responsibility taken and more accounts reviewed and managed. I was actually at a presentation last week that was looking into AI, kind of somewhat random, but it was a presentation on audio and digital audio within the Irish market, but they particularly also looked at AI and the impact of it. One of the figures that they quoted was something like Meta have taken down 1.4 billion fake sites in the last year. And that number is obviously kind of continuing to grow. And I know those fake sites often are to do with kind of scams and kind of financial scams and things like that, but they also have a role to play in the potential cancel culture. So I think there's an increasing pressure for the social media platforms themselves to self-regulate and to review and verify their users and to make sure that they are credible and legitimate, and also to insist on the kind of the delivery of or people living up to the standards in terms of hate speech and things like that going on within them. In terms of legislation, I suppose what worries me is when legislation goes too far and it kind of basically curbs people being able to talk and discuss. So I think it's a tough one. I'm not sure how they'll get the balance right, but I do think there's at least needs to be guidance and more pressure put on the social media platforms themselves to supporting and protecting kind of consumers or people in general.
Yes, fascinating area. I'm sure there's a lot more to come with that. What are your thoughts on a brand not taking a political stance on anything and actively avoiding talking about current issues altogether? Would that render them as totally insensitive with their consumers?
Not at all. I think I had discussions with one of my old colleagues on this in a podcast, and he was in a similar kind of place where there's no problem with brands stepping into political and social issues if they can back it up. But I also think there's no damage to a brand if they don't, because essentially for most of us, a brand is just, it's a kind of product kind of want to see and use. There are times where brands believe that consumers care about them far more than they do. A lot of brands, if I was to kind of list off, I don't know, which butter did you buy in your weekly shop? It's people have a kind of portfolio and a suite of brands that they want to kind of feel that they're credible. So if a brand was overtly aligned with negative kind of values, then yes, I think it's an issue. But if the brand is just keeping quiet and ticking along, that's not a problem either.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Maxine. Just got a couple more questions. So this one is, it seems like social media was born from a good place, but you talk about the fact that the technology sitting behind these platforms can create a sort of confirmation bias at scale. What's happening here?
I think it's, I think to a degree, it's an unintended consequence. So basically, the social media platforms want to make sure that they want to increase their use. They want to increase the number of users. They want to increase the length of time people are on their sites, the number of posts that they engage with, etc. So they've built out algorithms that understand what you have been engaging with. So, for example, if you've engaged with a post about fly fishing, then what it means is those algorithms will kind of kick in to give you more content about fly fishing. And to a large extent, that's a positive, because it means that the algorithms are identifying and understanding your behaviors, your interests, and they're feeding you more of it. The problem lies that they're a victim of their own success, that if you are engaging with posts about fly fishing, you're going to see loads and loads and loads of them, and that will create that confirmation bias. It will kind of be all around that. So once people start, for example, if we were to go down if we were to take J.K. Rowling and the kind of the trans debate and the two different sides on that, if you were someone who had engaged with her posts or engaged with her kind of followers' posts and kind of positivity and those opinions, what will happen is the algorithms will mean that you will see more from people who've engaged with her posts, more from people who are saying kind of similar things to her. Whereas if you have engaged with posts that are saying kind of the opposite, you will start to see more and more posts. So it kind of puts you in that echo chamber, and it gives blinkers to people, because you think you're seeing all of this content and you think that you're seeing the conversations that are happening on social media, when in reality you're just seeing one small portion of them, because those are the ones that you've engaged with, and as you see more of them, you engage with more of those, and it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're continuing to see the same things. Does that make sense?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, thank you very much for sort of clarifying that, what's going on there. The final question then, Maxine. There are loads of examples of brands getting it wrong, and if a brand makes a misstep, then in the world we live in, the consequences can be huge. People are up in arms on social platforms and calling for boycotts. What do you think brands should do when they mess up? Should they keep quiet or own it and go public with an apology or correction?
I think when it's kind of kicked off and it's once it starts to become a kind of a significantly noted movement on social media and people are really kind of pushing against the brand, I think the brand has to act. I think sometimes a brand can keep its head down and just weather the storm, but it tends to be only when that misstep is relatively inconsequential and the attention will drift off quite quickly. But once it's a big one, I think the L'Oreal example shows that you can correct it, you can get it right. Acknowledging that they've made a mistake is beneficial, but being able to back that acknowledgement with genuine actions to correct their mistake and show that they've learned from it and they're putting in kind of better practices in place, that's the way forward. And I think the L'Oreal example gives a good kind of framework that it's not only holding your hands up, going mea culpa, yeah, we kind of messed up. But you know what? We understand that we messed up. This is what we've learned. This is what we're doing. This is how we're going to be better. People have respect for that. It's kind of being able to hold your hands up and go, yeah, messed up, but this is what I'm doing. So I think that's what brands need to do when that situation arises. It's just unfortunate that you have to be true to the kind of the brand and stand by it. You can't just be a bit kind of wishy-washy and go, oops, sorry, it's not enough.
I guess the sort of one of the main messages from all of this, I guess, is brands need to be consistent and authentic in the way that they approach things. Yeah, so fascinating subject. Thank you once again, Maxine. That was really, really great presentation. We hope you've enjoyed the session. I found it interesting and worthwhile. So just leaves me to say a final thank you to you for joining us today. We do hope you've enjoyed the webinar. Take care, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again in the new year.